started to read the Quran for one arrogant reason, and that was that I wanted to find a contradiction. I threw away the articles, the leaflets, the cassettes. I put the Quran away. It was becoming too much for me mentally, emotionally. I've become Muslim, and this is me now. It was a very painful moment when she said to me, I've done my job. I no longer need to be your mother, and you're on your own. To be rejected by your mother is very, very painful. Very, very painful. I couldn't find where I belonged. I felt incredibly lonely, that it became too much. I called my mother and I said to her, please come and take me home. And I stopped practicing Islam. So I took off my hijab, I stopped praying.
Assalamu alaikum, Sister Alia Umrayyan. Thank you for accepting our invitation. I want to start with, who is Alia Umrayyan, and can you tell us briefly about your life?
Wa alaikum salam rahmatullah. First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity. I was born and raised in East London. I grew up in a predominantly Muslim area. It was predominantly a Bangladeshi area. And so I would see Muslims quite a lot. So I'm of mixed race. My mother is Italian and my father is Nigerian from West Africa. But I think whenever I'm asked this question, I just think Alia is a soul that wants to journey to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
How was your life in regards to faith? What were you believing in?
I grew up as a Christian. I became a born-again Christian actually as a teenager. I always believed in God. My mother raised me in a way that encouraged me to be curious about life and purpose and the world. And so even though I became a born-again Christian, there were kind of gaps. So I questioned the kind of fundamentals of Christianity at a very, very young age, and found that whilst emotionally and spiritually I was inclined towards the faith, rationally it didn't sit with me. And so I actually ended up leaving the faith. My father's background is very, very interesting because he was actually born a Muslim. My grandfather was Muslim. When my grandfather died long before I was born, my father left Islam. And so when he met my mother in London, he wasn't a Muslim. So I was never, brought up upon Islam. There was no form of Islam. He wasn't Muslim.
What was the thing that made you question your beliefs?
So I remember going to church with my mother. I would go to church and spiritually and emotionally it would be very, very fulfilling. But I had questions. I couldn't understand how we were worshipping the Son of God. I couldn't understand how in one moment he was the Son of God and the next moment he was the Lord. But more importantly, he was a man, that he was a human being like myself. And I couldn't understand logically and rationally how I could worship another human being. That didn't sit right with me at a very, very young age. And so I questioned that. And I remember one particular day speaking to the pastor of the church and saying to him, and asking him this question. And he said, just have faith. And it was at that moment that I knew that this wasn't for me.
How did you first hear about Islam?
So I have to take you back to my very, very early childhood in order to answer this question. So I grew up in a predominantly Muslim area. It was a Bangladeshi area. And opposite where I lived, I lived on the first floor. I was about 8 years old. I would go to the living room window, lean on the living room windowsill, and I would be able to see on the ground floor opposite the road from where I live. And there was a makeshift masjid. It was actually a container at the time. But from where I would lean as a child, I could see into the prayer area of this kind of makeshift mosque. And I found it fascinating. And I would see them enter and I would see them bow and prostrate. And I would find it fascinating as a child. And I would, rush to the windowsill, a few times a day just to kind of capture this. So around the same age, unfortunately, things were quite bad at home. My parents were constantly fighting. They didn't get on. There were constant arguments, constant fights. And I remember one particular day, there was a huge fight between my mother and father. And I ran to my bedroom. I was about 8 years old. On my way to the bedroom, I took my mother's shawl. It was a beautiful kind of Asian shawl that she had been gifted by her Pakistani work colleague. And I took the shawl and I threw it onto the ground. And I made sujood. I prostrated and I said, God, and I remember I said, God, make them stop arguing. But at that time, obviously I was a young child. I didn't know exactly what I was doing, but I was copying what I had seen in the masjid, and I felt that God would hear me because that was a position that was close to God. That's how I felt at the time. So that was kind of like my first experience of Islam. And then there's another one. Fast forward 2 years, I was 10 years old. I was at school. I came home from school and we heard news that one of our classmates, who was actually in my class, he had finished school, ran over the road to purchase some playing cards that were very popular at the time. And he had got knocked over by a big truck and he died instantly. And school wrote home to all his classmates and invited them to his funeral, which was going to take place in a couple of days' time. So I begged my mum to let me go. And there were a few of us who were non-Muslims in the class. And she said yes. And I remember saying to my friend, Layla, who was my best friend at the time, she was from Somalia. I said to her, can I borrow a scarf? And she said yes. So she gave me a scarf. And I remember walking into East London Mosque. I think I was the only non-Muslim child that went to the funeral. And I prayed Dhuhr and I prayed the Janazah prayer thereafter. And I remember in the Dhuhr prayer making sujood and feeling this sense of closeness that I had felt when I made it, 2 years earlier. And that was kind of like my second experience of Islam.
What happened that you started to become closer to Islam?
So things became worse at home, considerably worse. There was a lot of kind of DV at home, domestic violence at home. I was affected by that mentally and emotionally. And subhanAllah, Allah placed someone on my path. It was a classmate at secondary school now. And she was a practicing Muslim. Out of all of the Muslim girls in my class, they were quite cultural, but she was very, very practicing. And she was going through something similar at home, but the situation between her parents was actually far worse than mine. Her mum was, subhanAllah, a victim of domestic violence. She was beaten up regularly. And yet, despite that, she was calm. She was at peace. And I remember thinking, your family situation is far worse than mine. I'm falling apart, but you've got it together, and what is it? How are you able to kind of get through this? Because I'm really being affected by this. And she said, it's my faith. It's my faith that gets me through. Now, obviously, I thought I knew who Muslims were, but I also felt that Islam was a very backwards religion. And I developed a great love for this particular friend. We became very, very close. We were completely different. I mean, I was wild. I was a bit crazy, very popular. She was mashallah, a practicing Muslim, and yet we became very, very close. And I started to look into Islam. I started to read articles. At that time, it was listening to tape cassettes. We started to read the Quran for one very arrogant reason. And that was that I wanted to find a contradiction in the faith to save her. Because I just felt that the hijab was wrong. I felt that it would hold her back from a successful career, a successful life, I felt, growing up in the area that I did, what I saw, was men walking, 2 miles ahead whilst their wives walked behind them. These were the stereotypes that I had. And so it was interesting because on the one hand, I could see that there was something about this faith that produced this beautiful sense of peace in her. And that on the other hand, this was going to restrict her. This was going to oppress her. This was going to hold her back. So I started, and we used to debate, and we would talk regularly. And as time went on, I started to become convinced that Islam was the truth, and it terrified me. I started to become convinced. My heart started to change. My mind started to change. I couldn't find anything. All I could find was a comprehensive way of life. All I could find were scientific proofs in the Quran. All I could find in my research was the literary miracle of the Quran. There was nothing. And that scared me, because even though I was young at the time, I've always been the type of person that if I adopt something, if I choose something, I give it 150%. So I knew that as I was beginning to change and I started to become convinced that would mean that I would have to change my life. And that scared me.
What was keeping you from taking your Shahada, and how did you become Muslim in the end?
So fear overcame me. fear reigned supreme at that time, to the point that I cut off from my friends. I threw away the articles, the leaflets, the cassettes. I put the Quran away. It was becoming too much for me mentally, emotionally. I was afraid of what I believed. I was afraid that I would have to change my life. I wouldn't say that I particularly loved my life, but I was free, right? And to give up your freedom is a very scary thing, particularly when you don't know what you may gain. And now I know what I have gained. So I cut her out and I just carried on with my life. And then I remember revising for my exams. There was a particular weekend where I was revising for my exams, but for some reason, I couldn't concentrate. All I could think about was Islam. All I could think about were the things that I had discovered. It was almost as though I was bombarded by these thoughts, these thoughts about the scientific proofs in the Quran, the existence of God, the proof of, the messengership. And it was just thought after thought after thought. And so I took myself out for a walk around where I lived at the time, just to get a bit of a breather. I came to a road that I would regularly cross. I stood there waiting for the green man, and the green man came and people were crossing and I just couldn't cross. It felt as though my legs were pinned to the ground. And the thought that was in my mind was, if I cross this road, or in fact any other road, and I'm hit by a car and I die knowing what I know, what I truly know, what would that mean for me? And it just dawned on me. Why am I not testifying to that which has already entered my heart? So I took myself home, called my friend. She picked up the phone, heard my voice, and she was just so happy to hear from me. And I said to her, I believe, and I need to take my Shahada. And that was the weekend, and the Monday I took my Shahada. Alhamdulillah.
How did your family react to your conversion to Islam?
Being the kind of overzealous, passionate, young person that I was at the time, the way that I told my mother was arriving home, knocking on the door, and her opening the door to me in hijab. Not the best of decisions, I have to say, not the best of decisions. And she looked at me completely confused, and I said, yes, I've become Muslim and this is me now. She thought it was a phase. Alhamdulillah, it's been a 24-year phase. Alhamdulillah. And it was very, very difficult after that. I lost family, I lost friends. I ended up on my own at a very young age. The first few years after becoming Muslim were very tough.
What was the major challenge you faced after becoming Muslim?
I lost a relationship with my mother. So there were a number of things that happened at the time. She was in a new relationship. That man had a hatred for Islam. He turned her against me. And I remember at the age of 17, it was a very painful moment when she said to me, she looked at me, I was 17, and she said, I've done my job. I no longer need to be your mother, and you're on your own. And that was very, very difficult. At that age, you need your family, and to be rejected by your mother is very, very painful. Very, very painful. So that was hard. And then after that, to then have to fend for yourself at a very young age, to get a job, to be alone, and then a number of other difficulties that I went through at the time, which were quite personal, without family support was really, really hard. So I was living on my own, and I embraced Islam through a particular group, an Islamic group, which I ended up leaving, and then I ended up kind of going to the other extreme. So I went from one extreme to the other extreme. And whilst all of this was happening with my family, I couldn't find where I belonged. And I was new. The transition, the identity crisis that you go through as a new Muslim. So I've faced rejection from my family. I've gone from one Islamic group to another Islamic group, both kind of at the end of, the spectrum. And I couldn't find I couldn't find where I belonged. I felt incredibly lonely, that it became too much. And it was in hospital that I called my mother and I said to her, please come and take me home. And I stopped practicing Islam. So I took off my hijab, I stopped praying, I distanced myself from the Muslim community. I still held on to my belief though. And I think I did that because I did become Muslim from a place of rational conviction. It's just that all of the tests that I went through was just too much.
How did you start practicing Islam again? Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. We realize that 80% of our audience, including this video, are not subscribed to our channel. As you know, we are a non-profit organization and advertisements are disabled on our videos. Towards Eternity is not just a YouTube channel, but also a madrasa. Here we try to educate ourselves and the youth Islamically. So the only reason we are asking for this is to spread the truth. It may seem like a small act, but inshallah, it will help us reach millions of people. Now let's click the like and the subscribe buttons and let's together walk towards eternity. How did you start practicing Islam again?
So I got a job, eventually I moved out again and just kind of carried on with my life. You know, I was free. I didn't have to deal with all the issues that I had faced as a new Muslim, but there was an emptiness. There was an emptiness and there was always something that didn't feel right. And then it was, you know, I spent a couple of years like that and then the emptiness became too much. And I knew that it was because I was living a life that didn't align with my beliefs. And so I started to come back to Islam slowly. And I remember, you know, people say that the Shahada was like the sweetest moment of their life. But coming back to Allah and coming back to Islam without the pressures of a group or without someone telling me this is what you need to do, this is halal, this is haram, this is, you know, you're doing things wrong. No, coming back to Islam organically. A journey again between me and my Lord. It was beautiful. It was so sweet. I remember reading one page of Quran every day in English. I started to wrap my hair kind of like an African style. And obviously that progressed to hijab. I started to pray again. And I came back to Islam and I started practicing it again. Alhamdulillah. And it was a beautiful, sweet moment because it was between me and my Rabb, between me and my Lord.
So what effect did this have on your relationship with your mom?
So my mother ended up leaving that marriage, which was the best thing. And she began to heal. And I think she's very much still healing. We began to repair our relationship. And that took a lot of effort, I think, from both parts, from both sides. And then in 2015, she began to ask questions about Islam. And I was living abroad at the time. I was living in North Africa. She began this kind of journey. She had all of these questions. And then in 2015, she said that she wanted to become Muslim. And this was at a time where my mother is an avid reader. She reads, she eats books, you know. She loves history and Islamic history in particular, you know, ended up kind of creating that curiosity and that sense of wanting to know more. So 2015, she did say that she wanted to become Muslim and she ended up taking her Shahada. Very shortly after that, she said that she couldn't maintain the faith. And I think that's because of her age. I think it's because she didn't have any Muslims around her. I was living very, very far from her. And so she ended up leaving the faith. And then 2021, she began to watch some YouTube videos and she came to me, she said to me, oh, I came across these videos by a woman called Aisha Prime. I didn't know her at the time, so I quickly obviously started to research and she's an American sister. And that led on to my mother watching videos of Sheikh Khalid Yasin. And she came to me and she was so excited and she said, I have come across this man. I don't know who he is, but he speaks to my soul. He's so knowledgeable. He is someone that understands history, you know, and she has an inclination towards history. And then she would watch video after video after video by Sheikh Khalid Yasin. And she would come to me and she would say, you know, I've learned this. And, you know, he's done this series about Jesus. I think it's called Historical Jesus. And, you know, she found it fascinating. She would just be constantly just watching and coming back to me. And I didn't say anything. I thought, I don't know what's happening here, but something is changing. And I would just answer questions. I wouldn't input. I would just let her come to me. She would just say, this man is incredible. So I took it upon myself to find him. So I sent out a message and I just sent out a message to my contacts and said, does anyone have the contact details of Khalid Yasin? And someone directed me to his Facebook page where he has his number and his email address. I emailed him and I told him what happened. And I said to him, my mother has come across your videos. This is her past. This is what's kind of happened. I'm a revert. I told him my entire story. And I said, I know you're incredibly busy, but would there be any possibility of you speaking to my mum? And I sent the email. Now, Khalid Yassin is a busy man. So I didn't even think that my email would enter his inbox. Maybe it went to his spam or his junk. 20 minutes later, he emailed me back and he said it would be an honor and let's talk. So we spoke and I told him the story. I told him about my mom. I told him everything that she had gone through. I told him about her new kind of discovery and, the questions that she's been asking and the things that she's been telling me. She's developed this love for the Prophet ﷺ. Things are making sense, things are aligning and it's not like before. And, she's really believing in Islam. And he asked me a question. He said to me, what's your mother's name? And I said, well, my mother's Italian name is Giuseppina, but, in the European way, it's Josephine. And he said, my mother's name is Josephine. And he said, my mother is in her 90s and she's dying. He said to me, your mother, your Josephine, is on her way in, whilst my mother, my Josephine, is on her way out. So he said, we're going to do this. You're going to say to her, because I thought, how am I going to get her to speak to, I want them to speak. But he said to me, she may not accept, even though, kind of she likes my videos. He said, just tell her there's someone that wants to speak to her about her research, her journey to research Islam. But don't mention it's me. Let me take it forward from there. So I went back to her and I said, oh, there's this man, he's a researcher. He just wants to ask you some questions. Would you be willing to answer a couple of his questions? She said, yeah, sure. And I said to her, oh, Mum, by the way, in my conversation with him, he told me what your name is in Arabic. She said, no. I said, why? And she said, just this morning, I was having a conversation with my colleague who studies Hebrew and Arabic. And I said to him, do you know what my name is in Arabic? And he said that he would let me know. And she said, here you are telling me what it is. And she was like, no way. This cannot be happening. And so they ended up speaking and I was in the Zoom meeting. I've actually recorded it. And the way that he dealt with it, may Allah bless him, Ameen. So they're having this conversation, but for some reason, she didn't recognize his voice. And he was just asking her questions, and it kind of led to what she believed. And then somehow, he managed to get her to say what she believed. And she believed that there was only one God, and that Muhammad ﷺ is his final messenger. So she said that in the video. And he said at the end of the meeting, he said, do you know what SKY stands for? And she said, no. And he said, it stands for Sheikh Khalid Yassin. She didn't hear him. He repeated it and she said, no, it's not you. And he said, yes. And she said, no, if I had known it was you, I would have been more, And anyway, what followed from that was that they had a couple more Zoom sessions and she ended up taking her Shahada again. Alhamdulillah.
Did becoming Muslim and wearing hijab restrict your freedom?
Upon embracing Islam, I have gained my freedom because freedom is removing the shackles placed by people. When you truly connect with your Creator and you connect with your purpose, you live for Him and you don't live for others. And that is true freedom. So whilst yes, I'm now wearing hijab, and yes, there are certain obligations I need to fulfill for the sake of my Lord, I am free. Because my decisions, my choices, where I go, what I do, what I don't do, is for the one that created and fashioned me. It's not for those who are on a similar journey to me. So yes, I'm free.
But some non-Muslims say, no, you're fooling yourself. We are free.
No, because they are a slave to something. There is something driving all of us. There is something behind the reason why we get up in the morning. For all of us. That could be family. It could be a job. It could be to chase wealth. It could be your own desires, but we are all enslaved to something. But I would rather be enslaved to the one who is perfect, to whom I came from and I will return to, than to something which is going to end just as I will one day. I once felt that Islam oppressed women, restricted them, and I realized actually that Islam, with culture removed, and I have to point that out, Islam at its purest form values the woman in such a beautiful way, according to who she is as a woman. The companions of the Prophet ﷺ asked, who should I love the most? What was his reply? Your mother. He answered again, your mother, your mother. The way that the woman is honored, protected, supported, understood by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then the kind of legislations that have kind of taken place via the Prophet ﷺ show that the woman is a diamond, really and truly. When I think about where I would be now if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hadn't guided me, I know that I would be lost, if alive. I wake up knowing that I was meant to be here, I was meant to exist just as I am, and that is where I attach my worth. I attach my worth to my Lord. When I do that and I understand that, I realize that a woman in Islam is free, is honored, is supported, is protected, and is held at such a high regard.
If you had a chance to speak to all the non-Muslims in the world, what would you say to them in just 1 minute?
I would tell them there has to be purpose behind the normal kind of daily grind of life. This isn't it. And if you think this is it, then that has to be the saddest conclusion that anyone can come to. Because this life is a roller coaster. It's full of trials, it's full of hardship, it's full of difficulty, it's full of injustice, sadness. So if this is it, then why were we created? I would invite them to think. I would invite them to consider the cycle of life, to take a flower, to look at how that flower grows from a seed and blossoms into something beautiful, and then wilters and dies again. I would invite them just to stand in front of the ocean and to look at the depths of the ocean, and that life exists in the darkness of the ocean. To take a leaf and look at the intricacies of the design of one single leaf, and to ask themselves, where did this come from? Where did this come from? What is the purpose of this leaf? What is the purpose of this flower? What is the purpose of the ocean? And then to think, I too am a part of that creation. So if there is a purpose of a leaf and the purpose of a flower, then what is my purpose? That's what I would ask them.